All right, it does look like we are here now live. So I will begin, Steve, by giving an introduction to our audience out there.
Okay.
I'm August Cole, the director of the Art of Future Warfare project at the Atlantic Council, and we are joined with Steven Pressfield today, who is the best-selling author of many memorable and arguably useful books, among them The War of Art, The Profession, Gates of Fire, and even screenplays like The Legend of Bagger Vance. Now, I was introduced to Steven Pressfield's work during the research of a book about special operations forces, and the Navy SEAL I was talking to had mentioned Gates of Fire as being a heavily influential book in his community. And from there, it led me to other titles like The War of Art that I mentioned. And I've found that to be some of the most meaningful reading that I've done about writing and about the military anywhere. So, Steve, it's a real honor to have you here joining the Art of Future Warfare project today.
Thanks, August. It's a pleasure to be here.
One of the things we want to talk about as we start out this half-hour conversation is The Lion's Gate, which is your book about the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. And I would love to start the conversation out to get a sense of what drew you to the subject, and also to almost immediately get into methodology, because when you write this really narrative history, it opens up so many possibilities, but of course it has to be very, very difficult to get right.
Well, I guess I was drawn to it in a way, kind of a Jewish midlife crisis or something like that, where it just occurred to me that I had been writing books about the Spartans, the ancient Athenians, the British, the Alexander's Macedonians, but I'd never had written anything about my own people. And I remember the Six-Day War. I was like 23 years old and in the Marine Corps Reserve here when it happened. And it made a deep, deep impression on me. And I thought, just put it in the context of great battles, great military events of the world. I mean, it stands up there with, Gettysburg or Thermopylae or anything you want to do. So I thought, this is just a great subject and it's time for me to do it, So that was the initial impetus on it.
When you look at some of the research practices that you had to employ in translating both documents but also primary source interviews, including conversations with people who aren't alive anymore, how did you weave that into that narrative that you built throughout? Because it's a very rich book. I mean that technically, but also it's quite gripping. You are very much in that moment in the desert with many of the soldiers who are doing quite dangerous things.
Well, that's a great question. Like you and I were just talking before we went live about, how we write books. And even though this was nonfiction, it was narrative nonfiction, I treated it like fiction. I treated it like a novel in the sense that even before I went to Israel, I knew what the climax of the book was going to be. It was going to be the moment that the Israeli paratroopers recovered and liberated the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, because that was obviously the emotional climax of like 2,000 years of Jewish history. And so I knew going in the structure of the book, kind of starting from the finish and then working backward. And I knew who I wanted to talk to. I wanted to talk to the paratroopers who were the first guys at the wall. I wanted to talk to the first Israeli unit that reached the Suez Canal. And I wanted to talk to a bunch of pilots who were in on that preemptive strike that knocked out the Egyptian Air Force in 3 hours. So thinking of it like fiction, I sort of knew Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 going in, and then, but you couldn't make it up yourself. You had to actually find the people, find out what really happened, which of course was much more interesting than anything anybody could have fictionalized.
How did you approach your interview subjects?
You mean technically, like how did I find them and stuff like that?
What was your kind of offer, so to speak?
Well, I sort of worked through 2 or 3 people. Lou Leonard, who the book is dedicated to, I asked him, and David Mamet helped me. Who do you know in Israel? And I wound up getting in touch with a gentleman, a retired lieutenant colonel named Danny Grossman in the Air Force, in the IAF, who was born in America and had made Aliyah, emigrated to there. And he had been the head of the American Jewish Congress over there. And he's one of these guys that just knows everybody. Of course, everybody in Israel knows everybody. So Danny basically plugged me into everybody. He would just get on the phone, give him the pitch, whatever it was. I could never understand it because it was in Hebrew. And he got me in the door to everybody. And he also kind of guided me to people that I might not have thought to interview. So without him, I had in the acknowledgements of the book, it's like about 3 pages to him. So he was the main factor.
When you step back now, the book has been out a little while, and think about some of the things you learned about researching and also writing this type of hybrid, history and fiction. Talk to us a little bit about some of the things that you learned and you might do differently next time, because I think that would be informative for a lot of other writers who are kind of wrestling with these same questions.
The one thing I'd say, August, is like when I started working on this, I thought to myself, I got to do this like a real academic. I got to do it like I went to Harvard and Cambridge, and I got in my mind much too formal. And I remember that when I got home and I had like 700 hours of interviews or whatever it was, I was like painstakingly, transcribing them, And finally, at some point, I could see I was getting nowhere. I just said, the hell with it, just start it, just write the damn thing, So I sort of did. Everything was just kind of fresh in my mind, and I just sort of went, just wrote each person's part in the story as it went through. And then once I had that, like the equivalent of a first draft, then I went back and kind of painstakingly got the details all right. But it's sort of like going back to being a fiction writer, and having a sense of the story and then telling the story.
This is a story that took place a long time ago, but a lot of it feels quite contemporary. And, that connection that readers have. Talk a little bit about the kind of reactions that readers, particularly in Israel, have had to the way you portrayed the conflict.
Could you rephrase that a little bit, August? I'm not exactly
sure. The book feels very of the moment in terms of the kind of tactical urgency of small unit operations that would seem to resonate, I would imagine, with many in both, I guess, the American military as much as the Israeli military in a current context.
Well, a lot of that, I think, was the technique of writing it. And one of the things that was, the people who are involved are now like maybe 67, 68 years old. So I didn't want this to be like old guys reminiscing. So I put everything in the first person and in the present tense, so as if it was happening in that moment. And the guys, as they were telling the story, were 19 years old, 22 years old, 21 years old. And of course, the story itself, the idea of, Arab nations outnumbering Israelis, surrounding them, predict they're going to drive the Jews into the sea, et cetera, et cetera. And meanwhile, all of the United States not coming through, everybody sort of leaving Israel in the lurch, really did give it a very visceral, in the moment feeling. And that was, but I deliberately wrote it that way.
I mean, you're clearly someone who understands stakes, right, from a fiction writer's perspective. And I felt like these soldiers were playing, so to speak, for the highest stakes possible. And that narrative technique really seemed to work quite well here. And that was very deliberate, it sounds like.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm a believer in stakes. I know you and I have thought about that, Jeopardy, stakes, time clock, all that sort of thing. And of course, it was absolutely for real, the real event. So
yes, that's right.
Portraying it as it happened. And in fact, as I found out the real events, I was just amazed at how high the stakes were and how left in the lurch Israel was.
The awareness at the time, that sort of situational point of view. There's a point in the book when you make a great one of your characters makes a great comment about a green soldier, a novice soldier, seeing no more really than the inside of their own helmet, yet a veteran sees, the whole terrain. Talk a bit about how you dealt with that in the context of the story, because many of these soldiers were quite young and didn't have the experience, yet they're also operating alongside veterans of the Israeli experience, in the military and wartime context.
That's a really good question, August. And what really helped the narrative was that the story was being told from people on different levels. It was being told by Moshe Dayan, who was at the highest level and had kind of the global view and the futuristic view. And then it was also told by 19-year-old sergeants and privates who didn't even know where they were. Guys who were in Jerusalem didn't even know they were in Jerusalem. Right. And I very much wanted to shift the perspective. Again, it's like a fiction writer, because you're aware that the audience needs to know what's going on. And to shift the perspective from kind of, ground level to battalion commander level to Minister of Defense level.
Which did you have the most fun writing? Which of those points of view?
Ground level, because I could relate to that myself the most, and the idea, being a Lance Corporal, that was the highest rank I ever rose to was E3. So I know the feeling of cluelessness. But it was also a really, like you writing Ghost Fleet, where you're taking the broadest global view and historical view. It was also great fun for me to detail what the guys at the really top levels were thinking about too, thinking about Russia, the United States, the future, oil, et cetera, et cetera.
It seemed like there was a really powerful connection you portrayed between the senior officers in the Israeli Defense Forces and the 19 and 18-year-olds who were forward. That there was a very strong informality that gave them some battlefield advantage. And is that something that was created, or is that actually how it was in your view?
No, that's absolutely true, because I mean the thing that really strikes you when you're over there is geographically, first, how small Israel is. That you could drive from the front lines and be home in 2 hours along crappy 2-lane roads. And at the same point, there was the IDF was small and made up, where people everybody knew everybody. I mean, almost literally, where the highest level commander could get a casualty list and he would know half the people on that list. And if you didn't know them, you knew their families. So that's, a real strength of the IDF still today. And kind of a mind blower when you think of it from the American point of view. Like, there was one statistic that I'll throw out here for whatever it's worth. I don't know if I have this exactly right, but I read somewhere that in Vietnam, the United States lost 4,400 helicopters. In the 6-day war, the Israelis had only 2 squadrons of helicopters. They had 48 helicopters in the whole thing. And half of those were down with mechanical problems. So the scale is really intimate.
The other aspect that was really interesting was the way that human life was a means to an end, that there was a real clear connection between national objective and using soldiers to achieve it, and that there was mission or nothing. And that really struck me as being something that was particular to that moment, or is that something you think in modern warfare we will see more of again?
In what sense do you mean, August? I'm sorry to make you ask.
Sure. No, yeah. The IDF had very clear military objectives that were really only accomplished with quite aggressive tactics that were going to result in casualties of their own forces. America today is, for good reason, very casualty averse. And I do wonder, is there a sense of national urgency that alters that, or are there shifts that are made that are permanent in terms of national psyche towards loss?
I'm still not exactly clear about what the question is, but I'll try to answer it.
Great.
Certainly over there, the loss of one life was really felt. And I think that's true today with us over there, because or in the Middle East, because our forces are, at least now, so small. And we are, the United States, risk averse, and so is Israel today. And whereas our enemies seem to be not risk averse at all. Right. They are almost welcoming the casualties that they sustain. So this is a real problem. It's kind of, I'm going to flash ahead to, I know what we're probably going to be talking about, why I've always kind of thought that it surprised me that mercenary forces have not become bigger than they are as a way of avoiding, risk averse and casualty averse points of view. I don't know if I answered your question, August.
Yeah, that was it. And it's also a great segue. We had received a question ahead of the conversation from a reader of yours who wanted to know when, not if, but when a sequel to The Profession would be coming. And that's something I've wondered since I finished the last pages and saw President Salter take.
Maybe you and I went together, August, with your partner.
Any day. Yeah.
I don't have any plans at the moment, but I certainly think it's such a rich area. The idea that Western nations will start to employ mercenary forces, much as the Greeks did and the Romans did way back in the day. And I'm still amazed that it hasn't happened. that no smart businessman, not that I think it's a good thing, I think it's probably a really bad thing, but that no smart businessman has kind of said, well, let me put together a brigade, you know, that has air support and artillery and trained troops, and see if I can get a few $1 billion from the UN or the United States or France or something to solve a couple of problems that are out there, and that then that the Western nations don't want to send their own boys to you know, to get killed in fighting.
It's an interesting question, and it makes me think that it might even be other nations that actually take that lead and not the U.S. Our experience with, you know, employing more contractors, civilian and armed, than deployed forces in Iraq seems to have been one swing of the pendulum. But a China or an African nation that were oriented along the lines of making that work could actually do that globally. So you know, is that character gent who you had in the profession somebody though who will come back, or someone you think often of, you know, even though the book is now, you know, a couple of years in the rearview mirror?
It could be. I really love that character, and I'd love to see him come back. I haven't figured out where. You know how it is. The muse will strike you someday, August, yep. And then maybe it'll pop out. But yeah.
Maybe this conversation will help stoke that interest.
As we're talking.
Yeah. The you know, the question about craft that I'm really interested in is, you know, resistance is something you're quite open about talking about. You know, writing is hard. Getting in the chair in the morning is hard. It's not always the way that people outside the process of writing something as big as a book, or even shorter work too. Back to the Lionsgate, talk about where you really hit some of the harder parts of resistance and how you were able to get through it, if you were in some cases.
It's another great question. It's funny that, and I still don't have an answer to this, even for myself, but I had tremendous resistance when I was over there in Israel doing the interviews. It was really, really hard, and I still don't know why. I just, unless it meant so much to me, I think that's probably it. I mean, one of my own axioms about resistance is that the more important a project is to the evolution of your soul, the more resistance you will feel to it. So if you have small resistance, it's only because you don't really care about the thing you're doing. But when you really care, when it's really coming from your heart, and you feel a real risk, what if I fail at this, if I can't pull it off, then you have enormous resistance. But in the actual writing of it, August, like I said, once I got rid of that Cambridge Dawn point of view, just said, sit down and write the damn thing. Then it went just like a rocket ship. So
there's a lot of like
a long time to get there.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question of, you know, the internal versus also external resistance. You know, when in Art of Future Warfare project, we often encounter people in uniform who are great writers and are trying to find ways to use that in their job, so to speak, as soldiers, and airmen, sailors. You know, what would be your advice to people in that community about how to overcome that external resistance to the value of, you know, creativity and creative writing in uniform?
Meaning the resistance that comes from like somebody higher up in the chain of command?
Yeah, I mean, whether it's carving out time, you know, to spend hours doing creative work, whether it's being able to integrate that into mission planning or operational concepts for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. There are a lot of people in the military that are wonderful writers that really want to write and really should write. And it's certainly, the military just isn't set up for that. You know, it isn't set up to support that or to carve out time for that. I would imagine you'd have to have a mentor or somebody above you that would protect you, or else, like you, get up at the crack of dawn and do it yourself. But in a way, you almost have to get out of the military and then write something about it. But that's a tough one, because I think even within any organization, it's tough to sell your own printed stuff, right? You write something, a paper that's trying to make a point of view, and it's so easy for it to be dismissed by the people above you, you know? Oh, there goes August, you know, shooting off his mouth again, you know, blah, 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 you know? It's a hell of a problem. I don't know what the answer is.
You know, are there in your kind of practice now and how you're writing and in sort of your craft, what are some of the things that are getting you in the chair every day? You know, you've talked and I've used Twyla Tharp's example before, but just the importance of getting in the cab, so to speak, in the morning to go to the studio. to train if you're a dancer like she is. But what are you doing right now that kind of gets you in the chair and gets you working the keyboard?
Well, I've been doing it for so long that it's my life. It's how I live. And if I don't do it, I start to develop symptoms. Emotional symptoms.
What kind of talk about that? What happens? What?
Well, I'll start to get in trouble. I'll get involved with people that I shouldn't be involved with. You know what I mean? Male and female. I'll start to. It is sort of like, I believe that like vices start to, when you don't do your work, vices start to creep into your life, and they get worse and worse and worse. They start with like potato chips, and they wind up with, crack smoking or something like that, or you get into relationships that you shouldn't be in, that kind of thing. But like I say, it is my life, and I get up like you at the crack of dawn. I go to the gym. I kind of have certain activities that I do to kind of get me rolling, and then I get back home, and it's almost independent of content. It almost isn't like I'm driven to produce story X. It's just that like a singer needs to sing or a dancer needs to dance, I need to be writing something. But Muse is great. She always delivers something. There's always something there.
You gotta show up for her to at least be there, and if she's not there, you come back again. The thing
sitting in the chair.
That's right. The other aspect of your work, and this goes back to the profession, but this question of the future, and even in the Lionsgate, I felt like I could have been reading something that was 20 to 30 years in the future, a small resource-constrained force using ingenuity, dedication, innovation. That actually seems to be, even though we are in this time of relative abundance, but there is a meme there that just resonated. And I don't know how to articulate it, but I felt like I saw the future a bit when I was looking back to '67.
I think there's something to this. I mean, I have a good friend named Jim Gann, who's a major in the Special Forces. Are you familiar with him at all and his saga? Mm-hmm. He was telling me that he was making a presentation to a Special Forces group a couple of weeks ago. And he's one of these really advanced thinkers on stuff, and a guy that was probably the first to articulate a tribal engagement strategy in Afghanistan. And his theory now is it's like coming down to single men. He's thinking about not even sending a team into a certain area, a tribal area, but sending one guy. And I think that in some crazy way, that may be the future of things. I mean, lots of those teams and stuff like that, but I do think small teams that can really engage with the indigenous population, I mean, really engage, like get married there, that sort of thing, like the British used to do. And I don't know, I mean, it's a fascinating subject, the future of warfare. Is it going to be like you guys are articulating in Ghost Fleet, is it satellites and cyber warfare? I'm sure it is, but on the ground too, like it's going to be people, individual geniuses, individual Lawrences of Arabia doing their thing, I think, from the West point of view.
Mm-hmm. I mean, when you look at the U.S. military today and its ability to produce people who are good at that mission, at that role, do you see a special place being carved out for that, or is that still a very difficult person to produce from bureaucracy that spends $500-600 billion a year?
I'm not plugged into it, so I don't really know, but I do think that concept is starting to get some traction, and I think that there are just natural mavericks and natural geniuses. And hopefully the bureaucracy will become more welcoming to them, although I'm not sure how that will happen. But I think that is if we leave that element out of our kind of long-range thinking, we're leaving out a really crucial part. I'm not even sure why I say that, just on instinct.
Well, I think it speaks to that notion of the hero, in the narrative context. And I feel like that is an underappreciated asset, if you will, because it doesn't have an organizational attachment like large concentration of 10,000 forces or a platoon of tanks.
Yeah, but if you think about the Middle East, and think about Lawrence of Arabia as an example. I mean, we're a Western force that's going into a deeply tribal regions where we don't really understand the dynamics of what's going on. And to go in there with a bunch of guys in body armor and, MRAPs and stuff like that, you can just see it's just not going to work. Whereas if you think back to somebody like Lawrence, who just went in there as just one man, but a man that really knew his shit,
Yeah, someone who had an idea. Yeah.
Had the passion. But again, how does a bureaucracy produce guys like that? It's like those guys arise despite the bureaucracy. So it's what makes a great story, and it's usually a story with a tragic ending.
Indeed. The other aspect too is that in the kind of global context, thinking about how that sort of heroic soldier plays out in different. Think about the Pacific, where geography is what it is, a third of the Earth being covered by an ocean. That there are some fascinating ways that could also, though, manifest in that domain.
What are you thinking about when you say that, August?
Well, if you have the ability to rally and motivate individuals in small contexts, and you can carry that through technology to disparate geographies, much like we're conversing now, you might be able to have somebody like Lawrence, who can say Aqaba over the Skype transmission and have that same effect. And I think that is underappreciated. And we talk about military technology. I think railguns and lasers, which are obviously decisive, but there are other very empowering aspects to all this that accentuate the human element. And again, the writer in me thinks that's what's very hard to explore. It's probably harder for me to write about a hero like that than it is a next generation's weapon system, but it intrigues me enormously.
And it's even the word hero is not, I think, exactly right here, except in a kind of a new dynamic, because I don't think this type of individual is like Rambo, carry that kind of thing. Right. More like Lawrence, where he's sort of deliberately putting himself in the background, and it's kind of authority or influence without authority, as they say in the special forces.
I mean, in a sense, if you really wanted to walk this forward, you could have it's almost a software program, conducting that sort of influence.
That's a great idea.
It lacks the romance and the sort of open desert, but that may be some of the future as well, given how we're also interconnected anyway. The conversation has been a lot of fun today. And are there any other kind of closing thoughts you want to share with us about the Lion's Gate or about the future of warfare?
I wish people would read the Lion's Gate, because it's and I know people sort of resist. I mean, American military people say, we in America, we think, hey, nobody else exists. Why should we worry about how the French fight or the Israelis fight? But I think it was such an eye-opening experience to me to talk to the people and to see to really get a feeling for that part of the world, which the stuff that's in the Lion's Gate is not in the newspaper. It's not on TV. There's nothing like it. And it really pulls the veil back off and really helps you understand what's going on over there.
And as a closing question, that's good. Are there any other projects you want to tease or tell us what you're working on next?
There's nothing. Well, I'm actually writing a book now about the writing of the Lion's Gate, in the sense of my experience as a secular American Jew going over to Israel for the first time and immersing himself. Now I don't know if that would be of interest of anybody military-wise. It's more of a writer's story, and about how a writer engages with his material and brings a shape to it and stuff like that, and how it changes you, how the material you work with changes you as a person. So that's coming up.
Well, that sounds like it's at the very core questions of narrative. I look forward to taking a look at that.
You probably would like it. It's right up your street, I think.
Yeah, well, this is great. Steve.
General would like it, but I think you would as a writer.
Well, great. Thank you very much. Please do. And Steve, thank you very much for joining us today with the Art of Future Warfare project, and I look forward to connecting again.
Thanks, August. It was great fun. It's a pleasure to meet you, and we will connect again.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. I'm August Cole with the Art of Future Warfare project, and we'll see you again soon.